coming out here into the countryside and building a greenfield brewery in an agricultural area, it was sort of this inspiration not to leap forward, but to go back in time.
So if you're wondering what an American is doing making craft beer in what seems like the middle of nowhere Japan, well, so was I. I love Japanese food and drink, but sometimes I just want something Western. And that, or at least the good stuff, can be pretty hard to find in Japan. So I was instantly intrigued when I met John at an event in Tokyo, and he was kind enough to invite me down to Izu to see where Baird Beer makes their craft beer here in Japan. So I jumped in the car and set off for Shizenji, which is in Japan's Izu Peninsula. The brewery is about 150 kilometers away from Tokyo and is surrounded by nature. Think luscious greens, beautiful blue sea, everything. And it's beautiful no matter what the weather. Which is good, because the day that we arrived at the brewery, it was raining cats and dogs. Which is also not so good for our audio. Why is Baird Brewing Company here in Shizenji, in Izu, in Japan? See what I mean? But there's nothing we can do about it, so you're just going to have to bear with us for some of these rainy scenes.
So there's various ways to start.
Yeah.
We built this brewery as a greenfield project 8 years ago. 14 years before that, we were in Numazu. So Baird Brewing was founded in 2000 by husband and wife team Brian Baird and Sayuri Baird, his spouse. Brian and I met in the Japan Studies program. And I think the insight or the dream was, in Brian's case, a deep love for Japan, and in his case, an especially deep love for beer. And the idea is to combine those two loves or passions and to make beer in Japan.
In the beginning, Baird Beer sold mostly ales and not lagers like everyone was used to, so it took them a while to get off the ground. But they stuck to it, and now they've expanded to have these huge storage facilities and processing equipment, while sticking to tradition at every possible turn. John took me first to where they store the malt and other ingredients that makes Baird Beer so tasty.
So we're in the, if you will, the raw ingredients area. So water comes into the building here. We store our grains here. We also store hops and sugar.
In this room, there are two silos containing the base malt called Maris Otter and a Pilsner malt. Most brewers use a base malt for all their beers, both light and dark. But just by adding a small amount of a secondary malt, they get something entirely different. Here, the base malt actually comes from Crisp Malting Group, which is based in the UK.
Maris Otter, in our case, has this additional attractive characteristic to it in that it's malted in a traditional way. So it's this reverence for tradition rather than this purely rational or economic decision.
The grains are then fed into this giant mill in a process called wet milling, where the grains are broken up in preparation for the next step, which is called mashing.
Through this bottom part, they'll be sent into the brewery.
But that's not all that's stored here. John took me into their secret freezer where they store their hops and other seasonings, and I have to say I was trying so hard to keep a straight face whilst I was in this freezer in my cardigan.
This is the hop freezer. Again, hops don't like heat and they don't like light. So this is dark normally, and this is where we keep hops in great variety from around the world and from the ones that we harvest here on site.
And I don't know about you, but I've never actually known what hops were. It turns out that a hop is something like a Brussels sprout that grows on a vine that you support with sticks and strings. And honestly, the only way that I can really describe the smell is that kind of almost citrusy, bitter smell that you get with a strong craft beer.
And unlike all industrial brewers and most craft brewers who use pelletized hops, we sort of do it the hard way, the traditional way, and we only use whole flower hops, which you can see here. And again, the idea here is that whenever possible to use ingredients that are minimally processed or closest to their natural form. It's hard to over-hop when you're using whole flower hops. You can put it in your hand and you can sort of go like this and you'll get some resins on your fingers. Oh. And you can smell.
Oh yeah, it smells, yeah.
and get a really wonderful aroma.
Yeah, that is that beer smell, isn't it?
Yeah. This is a variety called Chinook, and it's grown primarily in eastern Oregon in the United States.
They also keep their flavorings in here, like this Dai Japanese navel orange.
Which is really nice citrus.
Oh,
And
that is
this
nice.
would have gone in
It's
our...
like orangey.
Yeah, it's a navel orange. And this would have gone in our Fruitful Life Citrus IPA. We also, once a year, make a habanero stout.
Oh wow.
And so this is a chocolate habanero.
Oh wow. Very hard to come by in Japan.
Yeah, so after primary fermentation, we'll introduce habaneros into the stout. And that results in a beer we call Smoke and Fire.
Oh.
And this has this nice warming character from the chili. So this is an ingredient that you're less likely to see in most breweries, except for many Belgian breweries. And that's where sort of our inspiration comes from. It's sugar, in this case, 2 varieties from Amami Oshima in Japan.
One way to make a high alcohol beer is to use lots of grain, which results in a rich beer like a stout. But other times they want to have a high alcohol beer with less body, which I can understand. In those cases, they take out 15% of the grist, which is just the grain or the malt, and they replace it with sugar. Sugar ferments through 100%, so it leaves nothing behind and leaves the beer nice and dry. So do you put it in with everything else? Like how do you ferment sugar?
Well, actually, that's all we're creating in here, right?
Okay.
We're creating a sugar solution.
Right.
So this is just adding more sugar to what we're already creating. And then we're going to have the yeast begin to metabolize it.
So the milled grains are sent through into the next room called the hot side to make something called wort.
We are now in the brew house. Brewers often call this the hot side. And this is a little bit bigger brewery than we saw at the entrance on the 3rd floor.
I told you that Baird Brewery started off small, and we actually saw that smaller brewery right at the entrance.
This is how Baird Brewing started. In 2000, Brian wrote a wonderful business plan, at least I thought it was wonderful. So the first licensed brewery, Baird Brewing Company, is what you see here. And Brian was using this on his balcony in Numazu for recipe development. Brian was brewing a lot, really almost every day. And so he was able to learn and get better and improve his technique and his craft. The capacity of that little handmade brewery was 30 liters per batch. This brewery makes 6,000 liters per batch.
That's quite a lot more.
So this is where we make wort, and that is the sugar solution that we're ultimately going to feed to our yeast. It begins here.
It starts with the mash tun. The milled grains we saw in the first room come in through this blue pipe, where they're made into a porridge-like mixture called the mash. The mash is then transferred to the lauter tun. Here, the mashed grains are separated from the liquid wort in a process called lautering.
And if you look in there, you'll see what's called a false bottom. And that's it, all around the bottom, a collection of stainless steel plates with very, very, very thin slits. And they're so thin that the grain can't make it through. So the grain is gradually going to pile up on top. But because there are these thin slits, the wort, the liquid, can make it through. So that's how you separate wort from
The grains are no longer needed, so they're sent to be used as fertilizer or animal feed. Then all that liquid wort goes to the kettle, where it's boiled and hops are added. But there's one more vessel that you might not find at other breweries, and that's because of the whole flower hops. Very little residue is created with pelletized hops, but whole flower hops need to be removed. Here, boiling wort is continuously circulated over the hops, and once that's done, the used hops are emptied out into a bucket down below. And you see all those pipes? That's the manifold. It sounds like something out of an ancient book, but it's actually a complicated system of pipes that are transferring the wort from one place to the next.
After we have boiled our wort, then we're ready to take it from the hot side to the cold side. Okay. After we've boiled our wort and we're going to move it over to the fermentation cellar, it's too hot. It's boiling. We need it to cool it down to about 20 degrees Celsius. So there's a device over in the corner there, a heat exchanger, and we're going to pass cold water one way and boiling wort the other way, and gradually cool the wort down from boiling to 20 degrees C. Having done that, we're going to travel with the wort.
This is where yeast is introduced to feed on the wort and metabolize to create alcohol and carbonation. The yeast are stored in these separate containers and are transferred through hoses to be introduced to their food, the wort.
This is in fact where beer is made. It's still at this point, if you open one of the little taps on the side, it would be what we call green beer. It's not green in color, but it's beginning to take on nice beer-like flavors and aromas, but they're still not quite articulated. Moreover, the carbonation is still not sufficient, so it's going to taste a little flat.
But Baird beer has a huge variety of flavors, including that navel orange that we saw earlier. So where are those flavors introduced?
So we'll juice in here. We'll have a big setup on the floor. Whole team, we're all squeezing oranges. We play some
By
music.
hand, because everything is traditional.
Everything's by hand. Everything's traditional.
The juice or other flavorings are then taken back a step to the hot side. The juice goes directly into the boiler to prevent any unwanted organisms taking hold and ruining the beer.
There's one other element. We have these little rolling vessels over here, and these are called hop necks. And this is actually one where we double.
When you introduce hops in the previous step on the hot side, you can lose a lot of that characteristic hoppy flavor right out the chimney. So to make a beer taste even more hoppy, they use these hop nicks in a process called dry hopping. The beer is circulated around the hops, picking up their flavorful oils. And for some beers, they do this process twice or even 3 times for that maximum hoppy experience.
One beer that we make is a seasonal beer once a year. It's called Hop Havoc. To get havoc and hoppiness, we do it 3 times. That was sort of an innovation of craft brewers, that the industrial brewers don't want that extra hop assertiveness. So all of their hopping is going to take place in the boil. But the craft brewers said, we want that.
So what's the difference between a craft beer that Baird beer makes and a commercial beer like Asahi?
I think the craft brewer, he or she, is really committed to variety, character, and expression of one's own sort of personality, a creative vision, whereas the industrial brewer has found a recipe that is broadly appealing, difficult to sort of take issue with, the lowest common denominator, if you will.
So the craft beer is more about the character and making it your own.
That's right. And the craft brewer, and certainly this is true of Baird Brewing, we love history. We love the different beer making traditions.
And that love of tradition can be seen in every step of the Baird brewing process, right down to the bottle designs. Each Baird beer has its own unique design, created by Eiko Nishida. The designs are made using traditional woodblock printing techniques, which are then digitized and show the character of each beer.
After primary fermentation, we move to an area called conditioning. This is just to let the beer rest and mature and become a little bit more complex and integrated in its character and flavor.
I mentioned secondary fermentation, and we're nearly there, I promise. But to do that, the beer needs to be bottled or kegged. Some kegs are shipped in from America for reuse, while others are Baird beer's own. But those reused kegs need to be cleaned.
So this is a high capacity kegging line. Because many of those kegs, especially the ones that came from the United States, they still have beer, a little bit of beer in them from some other brewery. And so this machine, actually both of the kegging machines have 2 functions. One is you lock onto it and there's a detergent is put in and it's heated and cleaned at very high temperature and then rinsed. And then it goes along the line, and having been cleaned and rinsed, it's ready to fill with beer. So the next step is automatic beer filling. Okay, so here we are. If we can get a light on here. Thank you for opening what we call the warm fridge, sort of oxymoronic. But this is where secondary fermentation.
Although many brewers will remove the yeast prior to packaging, at Baird Beer they're still here, just taking a little rest. So when they're put into a comfy 20 degrees Celsius and given that extra sugary snack, they get excited and start fermenting again, creating more carbonation but no additional alcohol.
And this is apparently quite close to the method of making champagne.
Right, and then that makes it bubbly again.
That's right. We have a truck that comes around and it takes it to a warehouse, and then it's ready. It's ready to go out into the marketplace.
So it's time to try it out. I had their flagship beer, the Rising Sun Pale Ale, which John described as a US citrus hop-forward pale ale.
I'm going a little traditional here. I'm drinking it.
Whereas John had the Shimaguni Stout, a very traditional Irish dry stout.
So again, craft brewing is about diversity, celebrating all the styles and traditions. So let's do that. Cheers. Thank you for coming to Baird Beer.
Thank you for having me. That wasn't the first time that I've ever tried Baird beer, and it certainly won't be the last, because there are plenty of tap rooms all around Tokyo, and even one in LA. So if you want to try some out for yourself, then go right ahead. And I just want to say a really huge thank you to John and to the Baird Brewing Company for letting me have a tour around their brewery and seeing how it's done. And I'll see you next time for more culinary adventures here in Japan.